when days began to feel ordinary, when routines replaced vigilance, and when life inside the camp started to resemble something familiar. How does a prisoner realize that captivity has not ended, even as it quietly stops being felt? At first, nothing about the day suggested that anything unusual was happening, because routine has a way of disguising change by presenting itself as stability. And stability, when repeated often enough, begins to feel reassuring rather than questionable. Mornings arrived without urgency, marked not by alarms or commands, but by familiar sounds and predictable movements, allowing the day to begin gently, without resistance or anticipation. Meals followed a consistent rhythm. Sleep came at expected hours, and the body adjusted quickly to patterns that did not fluctuate, because the body responds more readily to regularity than to meaning. What made this adjustment so effective was its subtlety, because no single moment announced that life inside the camp had begun to resemble something ordinary. And without such a moment, there was nothing to challenge or resist. The men continued to recognize where they were, aware in an abstract sense that they remained prisoners. Yet this awareness did not intrude upon daily experience, remaining distant and theoretical rather than immediate and felt. As routines solidified, attention shifted away from the boundaries of captivity and toward the small details of daily life, details that demanded focus simply by repeating themselves without variation. Tasks, whether assigned or chosen, no longer carried emotional weight, becoming simply part of the flow of the day, neither burdensome nor meaningful enough to provoke reflection. Time passed in measured segments, divided by meals, rest, and activity, and this division gave shape to the day in ways that reduced the need to think beyond the present moment. What once might have been perceived as confinement now functioned as environment, because environment, unlike confinement, does not demand constant acknowledgement to exert influence. The absence of acute discomfort reinforced this shift, because when suffering is muted, attention naturally drifts toward what is manageable rather than what is unresolved. The men found themselves responding more to routine cues than to the larger reality of their situation, waking, eating, moving, and resting in accordance with habit rather than intention. This did not occur through denial or forgetfulness, but through adaptation, as the mind prioritized continuity over confrontation in order to preserve equilibrium. Days that resembled one another closely enough required less interpretation, and interpretation, when unnecessary, gradually falls away, leaving behind a simplified experience of time. As the extraordinary became familiar, it ceased to register as extraordinary at all, blending seamlessly into the background of daily life. The camp, unchanged and predictable, offered no interruption to this process, allowing normality to settle without challenge, reinforced by repetition rather than persuasion. The men did not feel as though they had gained freedom, nor did they feel its absence sharply, existing instead within a narrow band of experience where extremes were rare and expectations modest. In this band, emotional intensity softened, replaced by a steady neutrality that made each day easier to endure and less likely to be examined. What had once required constant awareness now required none, because awareness itself consumes energy and the mind conserves energy whenever possible. Gradually, the distinction between life before and life within began to lose clarity, not because memory faded, but because memory no longer served a practical function in daily survival. The men became proficient at living within the present structure, navigating its rhythms with ease, and proficiency, once achieved, reduces the impulse to question the framework that made it possible. In this way, captivity did not announce its transformation into something familiar, but achieved it quietly, through days that felt manageable enough to pass without resistance. By the end of this early phase, normality had not replaced captivity in name, but it had begun to replace it in feeling, creating a condition in which being a prisoner was still true, yet no longer constantly felt. If you'd like to hear future stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel. As the ordinary rhythm of the days continued uninterrupted, the men found that awareness no longer accompanied each action in the way it once had, because awareness requires contrast, and contrast had been softened by repetition until it rarely demanded attention. They still knew where they were, and they still understood the boundaries that defined their situation. Yet this understanding existed more as background knowledge than as an active presence shaping thought or behavior. Routine took over quietly, guiding movement and expectation with a consistency that reduced the need for reflection, because reflection interrupts flow, and flow had become the most comfortable state available. The mind adjusted by narrowing its focus to what was immediately in front of it, responding to the next task, the next meal, or the next period of rest, without extending attention toward the larger structure that made these moments possible. In doing so, the men experienced a subtle relief, because sustained awareness of captivity requires effort, and effort had already been diminished by long exposure to unchanging conditions. What replaced that awareness was not ignorance, but a form of selective attention, one that prioritized continuity and predictability over meaning, allowing the days to unfold without internal resistance. The camp environment supported this shift through its stability, offering few surprises and little variation, reinforcing the impression that nothing required urgent consideration beyond what the present moment presented. As routines became more ingrained, they began to function independently of thought, turning actions into responses rather than choices. And when actions are no longer chosen, they rarely prompt self-examination. The men no longer marked the passage of time by significant events or internal milestones, but by the repetition of familiar sequences, each one reinforcing the sense that life within the camp followed a dependable pattern. This dependability reduced anxiety, because uncertainty often causes distress, and here uncertainty had been replaced by regularity, even if that regularity existed within confinement. Over time, the emotional response to captivity softened further, not because conditions improved dramatically, but because the mind adapted to what it could predict and therefore manage. Moments that might once have provoked reflection, such as pauses between activities or quiet intervals at the end of the day, were increasingly filled with rest rather than thought, as fatigue and familiarity discouraged deeper engagement. The men did not consciously choose to disengage from awareness, but disengagement emerged naturally as a byproduct of adaptation, because maintaining constant vigilance without change offers little return. As a result, captivity ceased to dominate internal experience, receding into a static frame within which life occurred, rather than a condition that demanded ongoing attention. The language they used internally shifted as well, moving away from concepts of waiting or endurance and toward descriptions of routine and normalcy, subtle changes that reflected deeper psychological adjustment. This shift did not erase the reality of imprisonment, but it altered how that reality was felt, transforming it from a pressing condition into a stable backdrop. The men became more responsive to the rhythms of the camp than to the idea of captivity itself, aligning behavior with schedules and expectations rather than with the abstract notion of being confined. As awareness diminished, the sense of time changed alongside it, because time experienced without constant evaluation feels shorter and less burdensome, even when it passes slowly. Days that once might have felt heavy with implication now passed with relative ease, not because they were less significant, but because significance had become difficult to sustain without variation. In this state, emotional intensity flattened, leaving behind a muted consistency that made life within the camp feel increasingly manageable and less distinct from any other structured environment. The men did not stop knowing they were prisoners, but knowing ceased to influence how they moved through each day, as routine provided enough structure to replace conscious awareness. This replacement was gradual and unremarkable, occurring through countless small moments in which habit proved easier than reflection and repetition proved stronger than reminder. By the end of this phase, routine had firmly taken the place once occupied by constant awareness, creating a condition in which captivity persisted in fact, yet receded in feeling, allowing the men to live within it as though it were simply the way life was organized now. As routine continued to guide the days with increasing confidence, the men began to notice a shift that reached deeper than behavior or awareness, because identity itself is shaped by repetition, and repetition had become the dominant force within their daily lives. They no longer defined themselves primarily by their status as prisoners, not because that status had changed, but because it no longer demanded constant recognition in order to function, allowing other aspects of the self to move forward without obstruction. The roles they inhabited day after day, whether related to work, rest, or simple participation in camp life, gradually began to feel familiar enough to accept, and familiarity has a way of rewriting self-perception without announcing that it is doing so. In this environment, identity was no longer anchored to resistance or anticipation, because both require tension, and tension had been softened by the steady rhythm of predictable days. The men began to experience themselves less as individuals suspended in an abnormal condition and more as participants in a contained but coherent system, one that provided structure without demanding explanation. This shift did not feel like surrender, because surrender implies conflict, and conflict had largely dissolved, leaving behind a quieter adaptation that required no declaration or acknowledgement. As the days resembled one another closely, the need to assert a separate sense of self diminished, because assertion is often driven by contrast, and contrast had been reduced to a minimum. The mind adapted by aligning identity with what was repeatedly experienced, rather than with what was remembered or imagined, allowing the present structure to shape self-understanding more effectively than distant expectations ever could. Memories of life before captivity remained intact, yet they occupied a different position internally, no longer functioning as a reference point for daily comparison, but as background context that did not interfere with present functioning. The men did not feel as though they had become someone else, but they felt less compelled to maintain a clear distinction between who they had been and who they were now, because maintaining that distinction required effort that no longer seemed necessary. In this way, identity softened rather than fractured, adjusting itself to the contours of routine without resistance, much as the body adjusts to repeated motion by conserving energy. The absence of acute stress reinforced this process, because stress often sharpens identity by demanding response, and here stress had been replaced by predictability. The men became more comfortable inhabiting a narrower range of roles, roles defined by participation rather than opposition. And comfort, once established, tends to stabilize self-perception. Even language, both spoken and internal, reflected this adjustment, as descriptions of daily life emphasized normal functions rather than exceptional circumstances, signaling a deeper internal alignment with the present condition. This alignment did not erase the reality of captivity, but it reframed it, allowing the men to see themselves less as confined individuals and more as occupants of a structured environment that simply existed. As identity adjusted, the impulse to question the legitimacy of that environment weakened, because legitimacy is often challenged when identity feels threatened and threat had receded. The men found it easier to think in terms of days and tasks rather than in terms of freedom or confinement, because days and tasks were tangible while larger concepts had lost immediacy. Over time, the internal narrative shifted subtly, replacing language of endurance with language of continuity, a change that reflected how deeply routine had embedded itself in his self-understanding. This new narrative did not require belief or agreement, only repetition, and repetition had been abundant. By the end of this stage, identity had adapted quietly to the structure of camp life, no longer organized primarily around the fact of imprisonment, but around the rhythms that defined daily existence. The men remained prisoners in reality, yet internally they had begun to experience themselves as something less sharply defined by captivity, shaped instead by a version of normality that had grown strong enough to feel self-sustaining. As the routines of daily life continued to function smoothly, the sense of normality that had formed around them began to take on a new role, not merely easing endurance, but quietly concealing the reality of captivity itself beneath layers of familiarity. The days no longer announce their limits, because limits that remain unchanged fade into the background, allowing attention to settle on what moves rather than on what confines. The men navigated their environment with increasing ease, responding to its rhythms as one responds to any stable setting, rarely pausing to examine the conditions that defined its boundaries. What made this concealment so effective was its gentleness, because nothing forced the mind to turn away from the truth, and nothing demanded that it confront it either, leaving awareness free to drift toward comfort. Normal activities filled the hours efficiently, occupying attention just enough to prevent deeper questioning, while never provoking distress severe enough to break the surface of routine. The camp structure, once perceived as a framework of confinement, now functioned as a predictable setting, offering continuity without challenge and reducing the need to interpret experience through the lens of imprisonment. In this environment, captivity did not disappear, but it ceased to dominate perception, receding into a silent assumption that no longer shaped emotional response. The men did not forget where they were, yet they stopped feeling where they were, and this distinction marked a critical shift, because feeling often motivates reflection more strongly than knowledge. As long as life proceeded without disruption, there was little reason to re-engage with the deeper implications of their situation, allowing the present to stand in for the whole. Normality thus became a buffer, absorbing the sharper edges of confinement and presenting daily existence as something manageable, even reasonable, within its own narrow frame. The mind, seeking efficiency, accepted this presentation without resistance, because resisting what feels stable requires energy, and energy had already been redirected toward maintaining equilibrium. Moments that might once have triggered awareness, such as quiet intervals or solitary reflection, were increasingly filled by rest or routine thought, preventing them from opening into something more demanding. The men grew accustomed to measuring their days by ordinary standards, judging them as easy or difficult, long or short, rather than as days spent in captivity, a subtle but profound redefinition. This redefinition did not involve denial, because denial implies effort, and what occurred instead was passive acceptance, a quiet agreement to let the familiar shape perception. As normality solidified, it created the illusion that nothing essential was missing, because illusion thrives in environments where comparison is absent and variation is limited. The camp remained unchanged, offering no reminder that might have disrupted this illusion. Its consistency allowed normality to deepen its hold without interruption. In this way, Captivity became something that existed alongside life, rather than defining it, a condition acknowledged intellectually, but no longer integrated emotionally. The men continued to function within this arrangement, not as a result of resignation, but because functioning had become easier than questioning, and ease often prevails when nothing challenges it. By the end of this phase, normality had become more than a coping mechanism, having evolved into a lens through which experience was filtered, one that softened confinement by rendering it unremarkable. Captivity had not ended, and nothing about it had changed in fact, yet it had been quietly concealed by the very routines that made life bearable, leaving behind a state in which being a prisoner was still true, but increasingly difficult to feel. As the sense of normality settled fully into place, the men reached a stage where the absence of constant awareness no longer felt noticeable, because what had once required effort to ignore now required effort to remember. They did not wake one morning realizing that they had forgotten they were prisoners, because forgetting of this kind does not announce itself, arriving instead through countless ordinary moments that pass without prompting reflection. The days continued to resemble one another closely enough that memory lost its function as a point of comparison, allowing the present to stand alone without being measured against what had come before. In this state, captivity no longer occupied a central place in thought, not because it had been resolved, but because it had been absorbed into the structure of daily life, rendered quiet by familiarity. The men still followed the routines of the camp, still moved within its boundaries, and still accepted its limitations. Yet these realities no longer carried emotional weight, existing instead as conditions that simply were. What marked this stage most clearly was the absence of tension, because tension arises when the mind holds two incompatible ideas at once. And here the idea of imprisonment no longer conflicted with the experience of living. The mind adapted by conserving energy, releasing questions that no longer produced useful answers, and settling into a mode of functioning that prioritized continuity over examination. In this mode, the past felt distant not in time, but in relevance, as memories of earlier days carried less influence over present perception, appearing more as stories than as points of reference. The men did not feel as though something had been taken from them, because loss implies awareness, and awareness had gradually been replaced by acceptance of the familiar. Even moments of solitude, which once might have reopened awareness, now passed quietly, filled with rest or simple observation rather than with deeper questioning. The camp itself provided no interruption to this condition, remaining stable and predictable, reinforcing the sense that nothing required reevaluation or change. What made this forgetting so complete was its subtlety, because nothing was actively erased and nothing was consciously set aside, leaving no trace of decision or resistance. The men continued to live within the camp as though it were simply the setting of their lives rather than the defining condition of them, navigating its routines with ease and little emotional friction. In doing so, they did not abandon hope or expectation, but these concepts drifted to the periphery of thought, no longer shaping daily experience in a meaningful way. Time passed without distinction, and with each unremarkable day, the distance between knowing they were prisoners and feeling like prisoners widened further. What remained was a steady state in which life functioned smoothly enough to obscure the reality beneath it, allowing captivity to persist without demanding attention. By the end of this phase, forgetting had not replaced knowledge, but it had replaced urgency, and urgency is often what gives knowledge its power. The men were still confined, and nothing about their situation had changed in fact. Yet internally, they had crossed a threshold where captivity no longer defined their experience moment by moment. Forgetting, once a defense, had become a condition, and in that condition, the most striking change was not that they lived normally, but that living normally made captivity increasingly difficult to recognize at all. In the end, nothing signaled a turning point, because there was no moment when captivity announced itself again. Only days that continued to arrive with the same quiet familiarity as before. Life moved forward through routine rather than reflection, shaped by patterns that required no explanation and invited no resistance. What had once been endured was now simply lived, not because the condition had changed, but because it no longer demanded attention in order to persist. And so captivity remained, intact and unchanged, carried quietly beneath a surface that felt ordinary enough to pass without being questioned. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.